This is my second video on my attempts to construct a small 00 gauge layout. See part 1 for my reasons for doing this, and see my lengthy series on my N-gauge railway modelling for more interesting stuff with trains actually running, etc. I'm afraid I'm really nowhere near the point of actually running trains on my 00 gauge layout yet. I did do a brief setup of the track on the blank board and ran a couple of engines round that just to check things out, which you can see in part 1. But since that I've been almost entirely occupied with basic landscaping tasks, mostly with the track completely removed. Now this is not so much a how-to video as a how-not-to video. I'm basically no good at all at landscaping. I'm not too bad at modelling. I've been doing one sort or another of scale modelling almost all my life, so for something like 60 years now. But landscaping is really a different kettle of fish, and I have pretty much no experience with it, and frankly not much feel for it. I've watched numerous instructional videos on YouTube, etc. But folks there generally seem to achieve great results with no massive show of effort. I honestly struggle mightily to do this kind of stuff and am not at all satisfied with the results. Anyway, let's turn to my efforts. If you're also trying to start landscaping, you may learn something from this, even if it's only things not to do. I picked up a few 00 gauge buildings from local sources based on the general idea I had for this layout, a small country station with surroundings. The station itself is going to be built from kits, so there's nothing really to show there at the moment, but here are some ready-made buildings that I picked up. And here they are out of their boxes. The Hornby Scaledale resin buildings are very nicely done. Those are the two in the foreground. The other two are basic plastic items, which are more rudimentary. I plan to put the goods shed and the engine shed on the ends of my two sidings. It's a pity the goods shed will end up with its more interesting side facing the back of the layout. The cattle dock will look better after I've done some painting and weathering on it. The station is to go in this corner, and this will be the road behind the station. I used this coach, the only 00 gauge road vehicle that I have at the moment, to judge the size for the road. Well, I also looked up information on the standard historical widths of British roads. What you see here is a scale width of about 20 feet, very normal for the 1920s, 1930s period I'm modelling. Of course, country lanes were often much narrower than this, and many still are. I sketched out positions for roads and a yard. Here the cattle dock has moved to the other side of the tracks, and I think it's going to move again, as I may need that area for my travelling post office equipment, which I intend to have. This is my revised layout plan as of this point. The red X's are power feeds and the blue lines isolation points. This mucking around is necessary in order to be able to park trains in the sidings, as the Bachmann Easy Track points do not switch the power, unlike Cato points, so all the track would be live all the time if I didn't use isolated sections with separate power feeds. I'll deal with the wiring in more detail in the next video, when hopefully I'll get the track back down and working. I went ahead and marked out all the intended roads as well as recording the track positions. The next step was to get a stack of legal-size paper to make templates for the hills, which are shown in pale green on the plan, which you can see underneath the ruler at the bottom right here. I laid the paper down where I intended the hills to go, and taping sheets together as required, and drew an outline. Here you can see I have templates for all of the hills in place. I decided to abandon hill number 4 as I was planning to put the cattle dock there, and now I'm thinking maybe postal equipment will go there. Anyway, hill number 4 has been abandoned. I went with a pretty rudimentary type of landscaping, leaving the track itself flat and just putting raised areas around the track. It's certainly more interesting to have gradients, tunnels, etc., but for such a small initial layout I decided to stay simple. Here you can see where the station is intended to go. I'm planning to build both the building and the platform from kits. Here's the sort of village area at the other end of the layout. I have a kit for a church, and I have some gravestones for the churchyard. The Scaledale Vicarage will go across the road where it's seen here, and a few other buildings should follow, probably mostly from kits. Once everything was marked out, I cut out the paper templates with scissors. Then I lifted the templates and marked the shapes onto sheets of 1-inch white foam, the same garage door insulation foam that I used for the top layer of the baseboard. I used the straight cutter from the set of foam cutting tools that I bought from Amazon recently, and cut out the bottom layer for the hills from the foam. I worked through all of the hills this way. This is hill number 5, the largest one. Hill number 7, the hill in the back left corner, needs to have its corner cut out to allow for the corner piece of the backing scene support, which is going to go there. Here you can see I've got the bottom layers for all of the hills cut out and in place. This will be the village end. And this is the end with the station and the yard. And here's the middle with the road junctions, level crossing and points for the yard. Here's the view from the end of the layout. Once the base layers were done, I cut out additional layers to bring the hills up to height. I decided on a simple approach, 3 layers making 3 inches for the hills at the edges of the layout, and 2 layers making 2 inches for the hills in the middle of the layout. Apart from anything else, I didn't want to make it too hard to see trains going round the layout, although I know it's often thought good to have trains hidden for part of their path. Once I'd cut out the additional layers, I used the hot wire cutting tool to shape the hills, though I was honestly pretty vague as to what shape the hills should be. Given the limited space available, I went for fairly steep edges to the hills, something like the results of stone blasting, rather than for gentle embankments. Here's the back left corner with the inner hill not yet shaped. Here's the massive pile of foam offcuts I ended up with after all this hill carving. I ended up saving the biggest pieces for possible future projects and bagging up all the rest for the garbage. I figured that I'd better create a raised area for the yard, as the sheds wouldn't sit well round the track otherwise. I marked up a paper template for this, and then I cut a piece from heavy foam board for the raised section. Here you can see the sheds being tried on the raised section, and they do certainly sit round the track better like this. So here all of the hills have been shaped, and a loco, the Bachmann Webb goods, is going round for the last time for a while, as the tracks are going to be lifted soon so that I can do plastering, painting and flocking without having to worry about protecting the tracks. For the next step I intended to use plaster cloth to smooth out the shapes of the hills. The plaster cloth comes in a roll, either 4 inches or 8 inches wide. I used 8 inches. I cut it into strips around 3 inches wide for application. You just dip it quickly into water and then smooth it over your form. I'm not entirely sure this exercise was worthwhile. The plaster cloth worked okay, but my foam hills really didn't seem very different in shape after applying the plaster cloth. And the plaster cloth does have lots of little holes in it, which make it difficult to get a really smooth surface with it. The instructions say to smooth it over with a wet finger, which does help, but I still found that the holes showed up quite badly even after the best I could do. At this point all of the hills are covered with plaster cloth. It took 2 5-yard rolls of plaster cloth to do this. As I say, I'm not too sure this effort really achieved much. The hills look pretty much the same shape as before, and their surface is in some ways actually less smooth, although some of the sharp edges are softened a bit. One thing the plaster cloth does achieve is to hide the joins where the hills are made from more than one section. I next attempted to smooth out some edges, etc. using moulder-seam plaster. I found this frankly a complete and utter dead loss. The instructions say to mix the plaster powder in the ratio of 1 cup of plaster powder to 3 ounces of water. Well, I don't normally measure water in ounces, so I really didn't know what this meant, but when I looked it up I was told that 8 ounces of mortar make 1 cup. So that would make the intended ratio 8 parts powder to 3 parts water by volume. Well, I tried that and it was completely and utterly non-functional, producing just slightly wet grit. So I don't know what the instructions meant. I ended up using about 3 times as much water as that, so roughly equal volumes of powder and water, or maybe a little more water. And the stuff still wasn't very workable. They say it should be workable for 30 minutes, but I found it barely stayed workable for 10 minutes and could only be kept usable longer than that by adding yet more water. And at best, I found it extremely gritty and hard to spread. It also seems much keener on sticking to your fingers and your tools than to the board surface. All in all, I found it worse than useless and would never attempt to work with it again, though I must be missing something, because I suppose it's got to be of some use to somebody else. They wouldn't keep selling it, but I got nowhere with it. Here are the results of my attempts to patch the edges of the hills with moldacine. Not really successful. I also tried to use it to edge the raised yard area and to finish the tops of hills. Again, with little success. The area on the top of the hill at the back here cracked apart completely when it dried. I took some time at this point to work on the track wiring, but I'll deal with that in the next video. My next step on the layout itself was to do some painting. I bought small tins of regular household latex paint in grey and brown to fill in the basic areas. First, I painted all of the track beds and roads grey, and also the yard area. I masked the edges of the roads with tape to get sharp edges to the grey. I didn't mask the other areas, as I didn't really need sharp edges there. Here's the layout with that first grey painting completed. At this point I turned to trying to find an alternative to the moldacine plaster, as I really needed to be able to form some elements. I searched the internet for sculpting medium and came up with this Crayola clay, which I picked up from a local craft store. Unfortunately, this didn't work either. It could be formed smoothly with the addition of a bit of water, so you could certainly make things from it, but I couldn't get it to stick to the hills or the board at all. So I thought maybe just treat the problem like fixing a wall, use filler. Even filler seems to have changed since I last worked with it. I bought this spackling from my local hardware store and also bought a cheap set of putty knives to apply it. I actually ended up using this slightly narrower putty knife, as it seemed to work better for the limited areas I was applying. I used the spackling to patch the tops of the hills where I'd failed with the moldacine. This spackling goes on pink and then turns white when it dries. It's certainly a lot easier to apply than the moldacine, and unlike the clay, it does stick to the surface. Next, I used the brown latex paint on all of the areas intended to be soil-based. I had taken up the masking tape around the roads and just tried to bring the brown up to the edges of the roads freehand as neatly as I could. I had originally thought that I might use this same paint on the hills, but the small tin I had was mostly used up on the board areas. So I ended up using some craft latex paint in a slightly darker shade for the hills. I left the sides of the hills uncovered by the brown on the basis of their being rock blasted. I dabbed thin down brown and yellow round the edges of the hills, and then followed with a wash of very thin black. The result is not great. Apart from anything else, the texture really isn't right for rock. But I'm afraid it will have to do for now. Next, I applied grass flock. I painted on PVA glue, actually Elmer's school glue in this case, and then sprinkled on a mixture of green and brown fine turf flock. I covered all of the flat areas and hilltops using slightly varying blends of colour. I wasn't too confident that the painted-on glue would really hold the flock down well, so I ended up overspraying with alcohol as a wetting agent, and then spraying over scenic cement over everything. Even then the flock didn't hold that well in all areas. I'd bought a static grass applicator, and this was the first time I actually tried to use it. I originally bought it with the idea of using it on my N-gauge layout. I got it to work up to a point, but the results were rather disappointing, not greatly improving the look over the basic flock. I was only using 2mm grass. I would likely have got better results with longer grass. I bought this grass originally with the idea of using it on my N-gauge layout. I was also rather shocked by how quickly the static grass was used up. I bought 3 full bottles, and it was barely enough to do my hilltops with a bit left over. so most of the flat areas still just have the regular flock, and even that a bit thin, although there is some static grass in some areas of the flat areas. The wet spots you can see at the bottom of this video, this picture, are from me sweating buckets as I was struggling to do this. They'll just dry up. At this point, I think I'm going to leave things this way and get the track back down soon. I'll see about improving the grass in some areas after track and buildings are in place. I may try putting down some gravel ballast over the yard area. Well, I will try, but I'm not sure whether I'm going to do it before I put the track back or not. But I don't want to leave that as smooth as it is like that. I'll put some gravel over it. Here's a close-up of the static grass on the hilltops. I suppose it does look something like grass. But obviously the more impressive benefits of static grass come more from using a mixture with greater lengths. Well, as I say, soon hopefully back to getting the track down and then setting up the wiring. Then all being well, trains can actually run on the layout, and then I can proceed with work on buildings, trees, etc., which should be more pleasant for me than all this struggling with recalcitrant foam and paint and flock, which is obviously not my forte.